In the west of the Greek world, the Italian peninsula extends like a long boot into the Mediterranean Sea. In the north, it is bordered by the Alps, which separate it from the rest of Europe, while it is surrounded by the sea on three sides. This geographic location gave Rome an extraordinary advantage from the beginning, as numerous bays and natural harbors facilitated trade, seafaring, and cultural exchange. Off the southern coast lies Sicily, a fertile island with rich farmlands, while to the west, Sardinia and Corsica represented important strategic bases. The plains of central Italy in particular offered ideal conditions for agriculture and allowed for a stable food supply for the population early on. The mild climate, regular rainfall, in the presence of raw materials like copper, lead, and iron, laid the foundation for the emergence of numerous city-states. The Roman economy was initially heavily agricultural. Grain and wine were the primary crops, supplemented by livestock farming, especially cattle and sheep. With the development of irrigation systems, agricultural productivity increased significantly, and new plant species were introduced. During the imperial era, this structure gradually changed as large quantities of grain reached Rome from the provinces, and many farmers switched to growing fruit and other more profitable crops. Beside agriculture, craftsmanship also developed dynamically. Pottery, metalworking, and construction were among the most significant trades. Trade flourished, connecting Rome with the entire Mediterranean region. Merchants traveled from Hispania to Egypt, carrying goods, ideas, and cultural influences with them. Similar to Greece, Roman society was also built on slavery. Slaves were an essential part of the economy, in agriculture as well as in households and crafts. A particularly defining characteristic of Roman civilization, however, was its political mindset. The term republic, derived from the Latin res publica, means the matter of the people. Unlike many other great cultures, Rome began its golden age not as a monarchy, but as a republic. The Romans were proud of this form of government and viewed it as superior to kingship. The last king of Rome was considered a tyrant whose overthrow left a deep-seated hatred of any form of monarchical power. Even in later times, when Rome had long since become an empire, rulers avoided openly calling themselves kings. Roman society was essentially divided into two major groups, patricians and plebeians. Initially, political power was reserved exclusively for patrician families, but over time, the plebeians also fought for limited access to politics. Nevertheless, the influence of the old noble families was maintained through patronage relationships. Patricians protected and supported their clients financially and legally, while the clients offered political loyalty and support in return. This system profoundly shaped Rome's social fabric and influenced both legislation and elections. But how did the average Roman actually live within this complex system? And how did these social structures shape the everyday life of an empire that would later rule half the world? The Romans placed great value on traditions and firmly believed that every citizen must respect the values and rules handed down by their ancestors. This idea permeated all areas of social life and gave Roman culture a strong internal cohesion. At the center of this order was the family, which was considered the fundamental unit of society. Several generations often lived together under one roof, similar to the family model of many Eastern cultures. At the head of the family was the pater familias, the male head of the household, usually an older man who possessed nearly absolute authority over all family members. The pater familias decided on property, marriage, education, and even life and death within the family. Adoptions were widespread in Rome and carried great social significance. An adopted child was treated legally and socially like a biological child, which could have not only familial, but also political and economic consequences. The daily life of a Roman family followed fixed routines. The day began with a simple breakfast and a prayer before the adults went about their work. After a short lunch break, work continued, while the afternoon often ended with a visit to the public baths, which served not only for hygiene, but also as social meeting points. Children spent their time playing, or, if they were old enough, watching the gladiatorial matches. The poet Juvenal coined the famous expression, bread and circuses, to describe how the government provided the people with cheap food and spectacular entertainment so they would worry less about political issues. This statement makes it clear that for many Romans, Food security and entertainment were the central elements of their daily lives. The Colosseum, a monumental amphitheater whose construction took 12 years, was the most impressive symbol of this entertainment culture. Gladiatorial fights, animal hunts, and even staged naval battles where the arena was flooded took place there. Contrary to modern perceptions, however, gladiatorial fights were primarily spectacular productions. The fights were choreographed to appear as dramatic as possible, and famous gladiators enjoyed enormous popularity. They received high rewards, gifts, and were carefully cared for, similar to today's stars. Deaths in the Colosseum were therefore significantly rarer than modern films suggest. Besides the gladiatorial games, chariot races also enjoyed great popularity and attracted masses of spectators. Every Roman citizen possessed the right to vote, but was simultaneously obligated to serve the state, particularly through military service and tax payments. Roman citizenship was strictly regulated. Those who had Roman parents or came from a recognized territory were considered citizens. In conquered provinces, the inhabitants were initially considered subjects and lived under Roman law without possessing full citizenship rights. Over time, however, people from these regions could also attain citizenship, for example, through military service or by being freed from slavery. Slaves formed a large population group in the Roman Empire. Anyone from a conquered territory could be enslaved. Their lives were mostly characterized by hard work and deprivation. Slaves in wealthy households sometimes had better living conditions, especially if they were educated and served as administrators or advisors. Nevertheless, this group remained small in number. During the imperial era, the living conditions of slaves partially improved as laws were enacted to regulate their treatment and provide some limited protection. Women played no formal political role in the patriarchally structured Roman society. Education was fundamentally denied to them, but women from wealthy families could learn to read and write. Despite these restrictions, Roman women possessed certain rights. They were allowed to own property and were not considered the property of their husbands upon marriage. Compared to many other ancient societies, Rome showed certain progressive approaches here. Clothing also reflected social differences. Men usually wore a simple, short-sleeved tunic that offered freedom of movement. Women dressed in the stola, supplementing it with a cloak or head covering. Members of the upper class wore the toga, a long and impractical garment that emphasized their social status, as it made physical labor nearly impossible. The color of clothing was usually white, but on special occasions, high dignitaries were allowed to wear a purple-colored toga. Since purple dye was rare and expensive, this color became a symbol of power and authority and remained so until the time of the empire. But how did the Roman state function, holding this complex social fabric together? And what political mechanisms ensured that a republic eventually became an empire? For many centuries, Rome's political system was based on the republican form of government. At the head was the Senate, a body consisting of members of the Roman upper class that prepared central political decisions. The Senate had great influence over legislation, foreign policy, finances, and the military, even if it did not formally unite all power within itself. The actual executive power lay with the highest officials of the Republic, the consuls. As a rule, two consuls were elected each year, functioning together as the head of state. This dual leadership was intentionally designed so that no single individual could accumulate too much power. Each consul had the right to block decisions of his colleague with a veto. Furthermore, their term of office was strictly limited to 1 year. After this period expired, they either had to be re-elected or returned to private life, though they remained in the political system as senators. In this way, the development of a permanent power base, typical of monarchical systems, was to be prevented. In times of crisis, such as severe military threats or internal unrest, the Senate could allow an exception to these rules. In such cases, a dictator was appointed who was granted nearly unlimited powers for a limited period, usually 6 months. This measure was intended to enable swift and decisive action without permanently endangering the republican system. However, this very instrument proved problematic in the long run as it paved the way for a greater concentration of power. Over time, Rome's political reality changed increasingly. Originally, the republic was tailored to a single city and its surroundings, but as Roman rule expanded across large parts of the Mediterranean, this system reached its limits. Military successes meant that individual generals gained enormous popularity and loyalty within their troops. This development weakened the balance of the Republican order, as soldiers were no longer primarily committed to the state, but to their commanders. Although Rome formally remained a republic, the power of individuals increased steadily. Even when the republic effectively no longer existed, Roman rulers held onto their republican titles. Later emperors also avoided openly calling themselves monarchs. Instead, they presented themselves as the first citizens of the state, as primus inter pares, and emphasized that they acted merely in the service of the res publica. This conscious preservation of republican forms served to appease the Romans' deep-seated aversion to kingship. In reality, however, the political system became increasingly authoritarian. Power concentrated more and more in the hands of a few, while traditional institutions remained in place but lost their actual influence. How could it happen that a state so dedicated to the ideal of limiting power was eventually dominated by individual rulers? And what role did Rome's military strength play, which was both its greatest weapon and its greatest risk? The military played a central role in the history and political system of Rome. The extraordinary military success of the Roman Republic and later the Empire made the Roman legions one of the most effective and disciplined armies of antiquity. The Roman army was organized into legions, which served as the basic military units. The strength of a legion changed over time. During the Republican era, a legion usually comprised about 4,200 soldiers, divided into 30 to 35 maniples, with each maniple consisting of about 120 to 140 men. In the imperial era, the number of legionaries rose to around 5,200 men, supplemented by allied auxiliary troops organized into cohorts. Before the reforms of Gaius Marius in 107 BC, no standing army existed. Legions were only raised for specific campaigns and disbanded afterward. For this reason, hundreds of legions were founded and numbered throughout Roman history, of which only about 50 can be clearly identified today. After the introduction of the standing army, Rome had about 25 to 35 permanently stationed legions in the early imperial era, a number that could grow in times of increased threat. Beside the regular legions, the emperors had their own elite unit, the Praetorian Guard. This bodyguard initially comprised about 4,000 to 5,000 men, but grew under later emperors to as many as 12,000 or even 15,000 soldiers. Ironically, in the late period of the empire, this unit developed into one of the greatest dangers for the emperors themselves. In the political crises of the late 3rd and early 4th centuries, it was often the Praetorians who overthrew or assassinated emperors. At the head of a legion was the legatus legionis, usually a senator from an influential family. Subordinated to him were officers of various ranks, including military tribunes of senatorial or equestrian origin. The immediate leadership of the soldiers, however, lay with the centurions, each of whom commanded a unit. Although formally equal, centurions of higher ranks enjoyed considerably more prestige and influence. Roman military discipline was extremely strict. Mutiny or cowardice were severely punished. Particularly notorious was decimation, in which a unit was divided into groups of 10, and every 10th soldier was chosen by lot and executed. Officers could also be executed by order of the emperor for serious failures. After costly wars against various opponents, Rome began extensive military reforms to transform the army from a citizen force of farmers into a professional standing army. Soldiers received regular pay, equipment, weapons, and food from the state or their commanders. The army was not just a war machine, however, but also a highly efficient construction organization. A large part of the Roman road network was built by legionaries to facilitate troop movements and trade. At every extended halt, the soldiers built fortified camps, which often formed the foundation for later cities. The equipment of Roman soldiers underwent changes over the centuries but followed certain basic patterns. Helmets protected the head, neck, and sometimes the face, even if the interior padding was usually simple. Armor ranged from chainmail and scale armor in the Republican era to segmented plate armor introduced at the beginning of the imperial era. The legionaries were armed with, among other things, the short sword known as the gladius, throwing spears, daggers, and various types of shields. One of the most significant transformations of the Roman military goes back to the reforms of Marius. Before these reforms, soldiers had to provide their own equipment, which limited the size and quality of the army. Marius opened military service to poorer layers of the population and had the state pay for equipment and weaponry. At the same time, the period of service was significantly extended. This professionalization increased military efficiency, but led to soldiers increasingly giving their loyalty to their generals instead of the republic. Thus, the political balance of power shifted permanently. The army also changed symbolically. The variety of legionary standards was abolished and replaced by the eagle as a unified symbol. Furthermore, soldiers had to carry their own equipment, which increased their physical endurance and marching speed, but also exhausted them more quickly. Although the Roman army consisted mainly of infantry, this proved to be a weakness in later times against mobile cavalry units. Rome responded to this with a stronger integration of cavalry units from conquered territories. Roman naval power developed primarily during the Punic Wars. Originally, Rome had almost no fleet, but in the fight against the powerful naval forces of Carthage, the Romans built large fleets and equipped their ships with boarding bridges. This allowed them to use their superiority in close combat, even at sea, and achieve decisive victories. Roman military strength was thus both the source of its success and the origin of profound political changes. It enabled the expansion of the empire, but gradually undermined the republican order that had once made Rome great. In addition to its military strength, Roman civilization was characterized by remarkable cultural diversity and lasting achievements in art, architecture, literature, philosophy, and science. From the beginning, Roman art was under the strong influence of foreign cultures, particularly Etruscan and later Greek art. In painting, a characteristic style developed in which interior walls were designed to imitate marble surfaces. Landscape depictions were intended to create the impression of vastness and reality, giving often cramped living spaces more visual depth. Portraiture was also particularly popular, seeking a balance between realistic representation and idealized form. Architecture was among the Romans' greatest achievements. The city of Rome itself became a symbol of power, order, and stability. Monumental buildings such as amphitheaters, racetracks, temples, forums, and bath complexes shaped the cityscape and served both religious and social purposes. Under the rule of Augustus, Rome was systematically developed to make the new order of the empire visible and to manifest the authority of the state architecturally. One of the Romans' most significant technical innovations was the development of concrete. This consisted of water, lime, volcanic ash, and rock fragments, enabling stable and durable structures. Concrete was frequently used as a core material and faced with brick or natural stone. Particularly advanced was the use of concrete in the construction of vaults and domes, which were cast using wooden formwork. A central architectural element of Roman construction was the arch. Through its design, it specifically directed the weight of a building into the ground and made large open spaces possible. This technique was used in city gates, aqueducts, bridges, and monumental buildings. A prominent example was the Domus Aurea, the palace of Emperor Nero, whose extensive vaulted structures set new standards. The Colosseum also owed its stability and size to the consistent use of arches and vaults, which allowed huge crowds of spectators to be accommodated safely. Linguistically, the Roman Empire was extremely diverse. Latin was the dominant language for a long time, especially in the western part of the empire. Nevertheless, there was never an officially established state language. In the eastern part of the empire, Greek remained widespread due to its cultural tradition and its importance for trade and education. Members of the Roman upper class were often raised bilingually and mastered both Latin and Greek. In the early imperial period, Greek also played a central role in religion and science, especially after the establishment of Christianity. Roman literature initially developed under the strong influence of Greek models. Works of epic and drama were already created in the early Republic. The translations of the Iliad and the Odyssey marked a turning point and encouraged the emergence of unique literary forms. Playwrights created tragedies and comedies that increasingly placed Roman themes and historical figures at the center. From this development, an independent genre emerged that dealt with Roman history instead of mythological heroes. However, only fragments have survived of most stage works from the Republican era. Poetry held a high value in Roman daily life. Poems were not only read, but also recited and memorized. One of the most significant poets was Virgil, whose epic told the origins of Rome and established the city's myth and literature. Ovid, in turn, dedicated his works to the transformation of gods and humans, bridging the gap from the creation of the world to his own present. The perspective of female figures from mythology and history also received attention in his texts. In addition to poetry, historiography also developed. Historians attempted to explain the expansion of Rome and to systematically record political events. Their works later became central sources for understanding the Roman past. In philosophy, the Romans oriented themselves strongly toward Greek schools. Stoicism was particularly influential, viewing virtue, self-control, and inner peace as the foundation of a good life. This teaching found great resonance, not only among scholars but also among political decision-makers. The Romans also achieved considerable accomplishments in the sciences. Encyclopedic works collected and systematized the knowledge of antiquity in fields such as natural history, mineralogy, and medicine. In astronomy and geography, models were created that shaped the worldview for centuries. Medicine benefited from anatomical studies and a growing understanding of nutrition and physical exercise. One of the most lasting achievements was the development of the calendar system, which later became the basis for the solar calendar in use today. Roman culture was thus not an isolated phenomenon, but a complex web of adoption, adaptation, and further development of foreign influences. Precisely this ability to integrate made it so effective and long-lasting. But how did an empire that ruled large parts of the known world emerge from this cultural and political foundation? And what historical events led Rome from a city on the Tiber to the dominant power of the Mediterranean? According to tradition, the city of Rome and the Roman kingdom were founded in 753 BC by Romulus. Archaeological finds show, however, that the area around the Tiber was already settled several centuries earlier. Various ethnic groups lived in central and northern Italy, including Italic tribes and Greek settlers in the south of the peninsula. Over time, Rome gained importance and prevailed against neighboring settlements, although only a few reliable sources exist about the early regal period. According to Roman tradition, the city was ruled by 7 kings. The last of them, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, was considered a cruel tyrant who turned both the nobility and the people against him. In 509 BC, he was overthrown by an uprising that marked the end of the monarchy and the beginning of the Roman Republic. At the head of the new state were now 2 annually elected consuls who ruled together, thus preventing a renewed concentration of power. From that point on, Rome avoided any return to kingship, and even later sole rulers strictly rejected the title of king. In the early republic, Rome began to develop from a regional city-state into a rising power. The Roman form of government combined elements of monarchical, aristocratic, and democratic structures, and proved to be extremely adaptable. During this phase, social tensions and political struggles between the nobility and the people occurred repeatedly, while at the same time Rome fought numerous wars against neighboring cities and peoples. A central principle of Roman foreign policy was so-called defensive expansion. Rome did not view itself as an aggressor, but as a defender that only waged war when it felt threatened. It was believed that only a just war could secure the favor of the gods. Among the most significant conflicts of the Republican era were the Punic Wars against Carthage. The First Punic War began in 264 BC and lasted until 241 BC. The trigger was the power struggle over Sicily, which was of strategic importance to both Rome and Carthage. After years of fighting, Rome emerged as the victor and forced Carthage to pay heavy reparations. Sicily became the first Roman province outside Italy, and Rome established itself as an emerging naval power. The Second Punic War, which broke out in 218 BC, is among the most famous wars of antiquity. It is inseparably linked to the Carthaginian general Hannibal, who marched his army across the Alps into Italy. Despite enormous losses, he succeeded in this surprising advance and inflicted several crushing defeats on the Romans, including at the Trebia and at Lake Trasimene. Rome initially responded with a defensive strategy based on attrition that avoided direct confrontations. But political pressure finally led to the decision for a major battle, which ended in the catastrophe of Cannae. Despite this heavy defeat, Rome did not collapse. The Republic showed an extraordinary capacity for recovery and mobilization. Step by step, it regained lost allies and prevented Hannibal from receiving decisive reinforcements. In Hispania, Roman troops captured important Carthaginian bases, while in Italy, resistance against Hannibal grew. The decisive turning point finally came with the Battle of Zama in North Africa, in which a Roman army defeated Hannibal. Carthage was forced into harsh peace terms, lost its military power, and had to submit to Roman hegemony. A third war against Carthage followed in 149 BC, but by this time the city was already severely weakened. After a 3-year siege, Carthage was destroyed and converted into a Roman province. Parallel to these conflicts, Rome also expanded its influence to the east. In several wars against the Greek states in the Macedonian kingdom, Rome prevailed and integrated large parts of Greece into its sphere of influence. By the middle of the 2nd century BC, Rome had become the dominant power in the Mediterranean. This rapid expansion fundamentally changed Roman society. The influx of wealth, slaves, and new ideas strengthened Rome economically and culturally, but also brought new tensions. A republic that was once oriented toward balance and the limitation of power increasingly became a state whose internal stability depended on military success and the personal influence of individual leaders. But what consequences did this development have for Rome's political order? And how did the path from republican expansion ultimately lead to the emergence of an empire that would endure for centuries? By the 1st century BC, Rome had finally developed into the leading power of the Mediterranean region. This era was simultaneously characterized by deep internal conflicts. The increasing power of individual generals and their loyal armies led to civil wars that shook the republican system. One of the central figures of this epoch was Gaius Julius Caesar. He grew up in a phase of political instability and first made a name for himself during the slave revolt under Spartacus. Although Spartacus was temporarily able to gather a large army of escaped slaves around him, the revolt was ultimately crushed, and the existing order remained. After these events, Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus joined together in the so-called First Triumvirate, an informal power alliance that dominated Roman politics. This alliance collapsed, however, when Crassus fell in the east and Caesar and Pompey became rivals. The following civil war ended with Caesar's victory. He had himself appointed dictator for life, which fueled fears of a new monarchy among many senators. In 44 BC, Caesar was assassinated in the Senate, an event that plunged Rome into another phase of bloody conflict. After Caesar's death, his supporters, including Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus, formed the Second Triumvirate. This alliance also soon fell apart, and once again civil wars occurred. In the end, Octavian prevailed as the last remaining heir to Caesar's power. In 27 BC, he received the title Augustus and thus effectively became the first Roman emperor. Nevertheless, he consciously avoided any open resemblance to kingship. He presented himself as a servant of the state and claimed to have restored the Republic, although in truth Rome had entered a new phase. The following approximately 200 years are often referred to as the Pax Romana, an era of relative stability and internal peace. During this time, the Roman Empire reached its greatest extent. Trade flourished, roads and cities connected distant regions, and economic prosperity characterized large parts of the empire. Although there were also tyrannical or incompetent rulers in this phase, such as Caligula or Nero, their excesses usually had no long-term effects on the stability of the overall system. Most emperors focused on securing the existing borders rather than incessantly expanding the empire. In the 2nd century AD, the empire reached its maximum territorial extent under Emperor Trajan. But even then, it became clear that further expansion brought hardly any economic benefit. The northern border regions, in particular, inhabited by Germanic tribes, proved difficult to control and of little profit. A devastating defeat in the Teutoburg Forest, in which several legions were destroyed, made it clear that the limits of Roman expansion had been reached. After the death of Emperor Marcus Aurelius in 180 AD, a phase of increasing instability began. His son Commodus proved to be an incompetent ruler and plunged the empire into political unrest. His assassination was followed by a short but chaotic period in which several emperors claimed power in succession. Although individual rulers succeeded in temporarily restoring order, the empire fell into a deep crisis in the 3rd century. Civil wars, economic decline, plagues, and external threats significantly weakened state structures. During this time, entire parts of the empire even temporarily seceded. In the west, an independent Gallic empire emerged, while in the east, the Palmyrene Empire under the ruler Zenobia controlled large territories. Only Emperor Aurelian succeeded in reconquering these breakaway regions and restoring the unity of the empire. His assassination, however, once again showed how fragile the political order had become. A lasting reform was initiated by Emperor Diocletian, who realized that a single ruler could no longer effectively govern such a large empire. He divided power among several emperors, laying the foundation for the later separation into a western and an eastern part of the empire. Under Emperor Constantine, Christianity was recognized and promoted, permanently changing the religious landscape of the empire. He also founded a new capital in the east, Constantinople, which soon became a political and cultural center. The final break occurred after the death of Emperor Theodosius in 395, when the empire was permanently divided between his sons into a western and an eastern part. The Western Roman Empire came under increasing pressure from migrating peoples in internal power struggles. In 476, the last Western Roman emperor was deposed, an event traditionally considered the end of antiquity in the West. The Eastern Roman Empire, on the other hand, lasted for nearly another 1,000 years until Constantinople was conquered by the Ottomans in 1453. Thus ended the history of an empire that had emerged from a small settlement in Italy and had determined the fate of the known world for centuries. Even after its fall, however, Rome's influence remained palpable and shaped politics, law, culture, and thought long beyond its time. With the fall of the Roman Empire, Rome's political power disappeared, but its intellectual and cultural legacy remained. Over more than 2 millennia, Rome had not only conquered lands, but also created ideas, structures, and ways of thinking that lasted far beyond its own existence. Even after the formal end of the empire, numerous political entities considered themselves its successors or heirs. The Holy Roman Empire in particular, but also the Ottoman Empire, invoked Roman tradition in different ways to legitimize their own rule. Roman law formed the basis of many modern legal systems and influenced the understanding of the state, citizenship, and law well into the modern era. The Latin language lived on in the Romance languages and shaped science, religion, and administration for centuries. Roman architecture, urban planning, and engineering served as models for later generations, from roads and bridges to dome structures and administrative centers. The Roman calendar system also remains the basis of our time reckoning to this day. Furthermore, Rome left behind a complex historical legacy. The history of the empire shows how a society could rise to become the dominant power through adaptability, organization, and military strength, but also how internal tensions, the concentration of power, and structural overextension finally led to its decline. The rise and fall of Rome is therefore not just a story of times past, but also a timeless lesson about power, stability, and impermanence. Perhaps that is precisely where the enduring fascination with Roman history lies. Was it military discipline that made Rome so successful, or the ability to integrate foreign cultures and make them useful for its own purposes? Could the empire have prevented its downfall if it had adapted its political order earlier? Or was the collapse of such a massive empire inevitable? Even though Rome is long gone, its legacy lives on. In our laws, our cities, and our thinking, we encounter the Roman Empire to this day as a reminder of how profoundly a civilization can shape the world, even long after it has ceased to exist.